Okay, welcome to the Muay Thai Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host, James Nicol. I'm a Thai boxer and nutritionist, and my goal, not only through this podcast, but in general, is to bring free education regarding nutrition to the Muay Thai community. Today, I'm going to be talking about what to eat and drink after the weigh-in in order to allow you to perform at your best. I'll cover the different types of weigh-in and different formats of weigh-in. I'll cover what our bodies actually require, what we need to put in after the weigh-ins, and I'll also cover why we need to put in each of these different components. I'll discuss how much of food and how much fluid need to be consumed after the weigh-in, and I'll also talk about which food this actually translates to in reality. Regarding the types of weigh-ins, so generally there are two categories. So you'll have a same-day weigh-in, and this could be from anywhere to, for example, 90 minutes or almost immediately before competition, like in BJJ, for example, to very early in the morning, like lots of Muay Thai fights here in Thailand. You might weigh in at 5 or 6 a.m. in the morning, and you might not fight until 5 or 6 p.m. in the evening, in which case you'd have basically a 12-hour refuel window. In addition to the same day weigh-in, you'll also have day before weigh-ins. Now, a lot of Muay Thai in the West and some here in Thailand will have day before weigh-ins where you weigh in either the morning, midday or afternoon, but this is the day before you fight. So typically you'll have at least 24 hours to recover. And this is also common in most MMA events. Essentially, what you need to do in this period between the weigh-in and the fight depends largely on what you've done over the fight week. So the weight cutting tactics you've used to reduce your body weight over fight week. So let's talk about what we need to put in will depend on what you've taken out over fight week. The only exception to this rule is fiber. So if you've used a low fiber diet to remove some weight from gut contents in the few days leading up to the weigh-in, you don't need to put this back in. Having more undigested food in your stomach isn't going to benefit your performance. And if anything, it might harm your performance a little bit. We want to avoid and minimize gut discomfort as much as possible. The other things that we'll likely have taken out are carbohydrates, water, and salt or sodium. So the things we need to put back in: carbohydrates, water, and salt. Now let's talk about why we need to put these back in. Carbs are the fuel for high intensity performance. And if any of you have ever been in a fight, you'll know that a fight tends to be pretty high intensity. Anything above about 60% of your maximum intensity will be fueled predominantly by carbohydrates. Regarding water, so dehydration, as little as 2% of your body weight can affect your performance. Being euhydrated, which just means not being dehydrated and not being hyper or overhydrated, will allow you to perform at your best and will protect your health. There are so many negative impacts and performance decrements, not only regarding performance, but also health as well, as a result of dehydration. I'll talk about a few of them now, but it would be impossible to cover them all and to keep this podcast at a reasonable length. But even just small amounts of dehydration can increase the strain on your heart. It's been shown to impair your aerobic and muscular endurance. Can reduce your muscle strength and your fine motor skills. So not only your strength, but also the ability to actually carry out and perform the techniques themselves. It can reduce your mental capacity, so your cognitive ability to actually perform in the fight. Dehydration can also increase your risk of concussion and decrease your pain tolerance. So if you're a fighter who prides yourself on your heart or your ability to take punishment, then being dehydrated can drastically reduce this. It's suspected that this decreased pain tolerance is a result of higher cortisol that comes as a result of being dehydrated. Cortisol is one of the primary stress hormones, and it directly relates to your pain sensitivity. In addition to these, there are a slew of other negative impacts, not only on your performance, but also your health in the long term. I won't dive into them here. I will link in the show notes to a great article from the Grey Matter Journal, which covers some of these issues. So we've covered why we need to put back in salt. We've covered why we need to put back in water. Let's talk about salt. So salt in the form of table salt is actually sodium chloride, and it's the sodium that we want from this basically. Sodium, it's an important electrolyte. What it allows the body to do is to hold on to water that we put in, rather than just drinking plain water, which is perfectly fine 99% of the time. In this period between the weigh-in and the fight, we want to get as much as possible. We want to hold on to as much as possible of that water that we're drinking rather than just peeing it out. This will support your optimal hydration. So adding salt to your fluids or adding salt to your food will mean that the fluids you're drinking, you hold on to them and more of them goes to rehydrating you rather than just peeing some of them out. So we spoke about what we need to put in. We've spoken about why we need to put them in. So now let's talk about how much to put in. You can't just down a load of water, eat a load of rice and expect to perform at your best. You need to consume an optimal amount of them. So for carbohydrates, somewhere in the range of 5 to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight that you weigh would be considered a good amount or a good baseline to go by. So let's say, for example, just for the sake of easy maths, you're 50 kilos. So somewhere between 500 grams, which would be 10 grams per kilogram, and 250 grams, which would be 5 grams per kilogram, would be optimal for you. If you're 100 kilos, then somewhere between 500 and 1,000 grams of carbohydrates. So simply take your weight, times it by 5, and then times it by 10. If you're somewhere in the middle of these, then you're probably doing quite well. If it's a same day weigh-in, you'll want to go to the lower end of this range, so more like 5 grams per kilogram, because you'll likely have a shorter recovery window. If you've got less time, then you can't afford to consume such an amount that you might be able to if you were having a day before weigh-in, because then you start to risk things like gut discomfort. However, if you have a day before weigh-in, then somewhere between 7 to 10 grams per kilogram that you weigh is probably optimal for a day before weigh-in. Regarding salt, so per liter of fluid you consume, you want this to contain somewhere between 2 to 3 grams of salt, or in sodium, that's about 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams of sodium. You'll also want to add salt to your meals as well. Typical sports drinks, things like Lucozade Sport, Powerade, are often a little bit too low in salt for this post-weigh-in purpose. So either you can add salt to them or you can consume what's called an ORS, an oral rehydration solution. These are formulated with the optimal sodium concentration to rehydrate you. So I've spoken about how much carbohydrates and how much salt. One thing on the carbohydrates as well is, it should go without saying, but don't just consume this all in your post-weigh-in meal. Try to consume a smaller amount every hour. You want to eat frequently. If you just binge massively post-weigh-in, yeah, maybe you'll consume a lot of carbohydrates in the 2 to 3 hours post-weigh-in, but then you'll be in a food coma. You'll be so stuffed that you won't be able to continue refueling. You'll just hit that brick wall early in the stage. So consume a smaller amount, but consume it on an hourly basis. Now, regarding the water, you want to consume 150% of your water losses. So 1.5 times whatever you've lost in water. In the final 24 hours, most of the weight you lose will be from water. So times whatever you lose in the last 24 hours from waking up until the weigh-in, whatever that difference is, you want to times that by 1.5, and that is your water target. That's your hydration target. You want to make sure that you don't drink too quickly. So you can only absorb a certain amount of fluid per hour. This will differ a little bit depending on the individual, but 1 liter per hour is a good rate to aim for. So try and drink about 250 mils every 15 minutes. You can also monitor your urine color. One thing to bear in mind, though, is that while peeing clear isn't necessarily on its own a good way to assess being hydrated after the weigh-in, it normally is day to day, but after the weigh-in it is not. Peeing not clear is a good indicator that you are still dehydrated, so you can bear that in mind. Now, let's talk about which foods and which fluids to consume after the weigh-in. So translating all this advice I've given you into specific fluid and specific food choices. So a rehydration drink that I am a fan of and I use with my clients, here is the recipe. So it's a liter drink. You have 500 milliliters of water, 500 milliliters of a sports drink, so Powerade, Lucozade Sport, Gatorade, whatever, just an isotonic sports drink, and then 2 to 3 grams of salt. And this is about half a teaspoon. You want to mix these ingredients into a 1 liter bottle, and you want to drink it at that rate I mentioned before of about 1 liter per hour until your total water target has been reached. And remember, your total water target is 1.5 times whatever you lose in kilograms in the last 24 hours. Remember that it should be in kilograms. So if you're in the States or you use pounds, make sure it's in kilograms. Once you've reached your fluid target, then you can switch to drinking things like plain water or juice if preferred, just to maintain your level of hydration. One thing to bear in mind is if you are taking part in a day before weigh-in, you'll want to reduce the water intake or taper it off a little bit before bed. So maybe about 2 hours before bed, just switch to smaller sips rather than purposeful rehydration in order to avoid sleep disturbance and basically just having to wake up to pee multiple times throughout the night, because having disturbed sleep is obviously not a great idea right before a fight, especially when you've probably got a lot on your mind anyway and sleep is hard enough as it is. Now let's talk about food choices. So there are a few different things to consider regarding food choices. So I split the carbohydrates into two categories. You've got aggressive. These are for a same day weigh-in or when you really don't have that much time. For example, you might have just 2 hours to rehydrate. So these will be really high carbohydrate foods. And then you have just simply high carbohydrate foods. If you have more than 2 hours, you've got a longer amount of time to replenish your glycogen stores, replenish your carbohydrate stores, then you don't need to be so aggressive with it. For the aggressive high carbohydrate foods, things like white bread or bagels with jam or honey would be a good idea. Low fiber, high sugar cereal, things like Cocoa Pops with some low fat milk. Jelly sweets, things like Haribo. Energy and sports bars, and then also sports drinks like Lucozade Sport, for example, or liquid meals containing carbohydrates and some protein potentially. As long as you have more than 2 hours or you're 2 hours post weigh-in, you can go for more high carbohydrate foods. So there's aggressive foods, they're probably smaller volume as well, they're more energy dense. You'll typically find in the sort of 2 hours after you weigh in, you probably won't want to have a meal of chicken and rice. You'll want to get that hydration going before you start to consume large amounts of food. If you do go right from the weigh-in to a full meal, you'll probably experience a lot of GI discomfort and maybe a dodgy stomach. So stick with those more aggressive foods, smaller foods, things like sweets, bread with jam and honey in the hour or 2 hours after weigh-in. And then once your body adjusts and once you get more hydrated, you can switch to these higher carbohydrate foods that are a little bit more normal. This includes things like pasta dishes, rice dishes, potato dishes, that can be white or sweet potato, any breads, that could be things just like normal bread, it could be wraps, could be pita breads, could be bagels, fruits, especially ripe bananas, they're a great one, dried fruits, things like raisins as well, low-fat yogurts, low-fat pancakes, and maybe even oats as well, depending on the fiber content and the portion of them. I'll talk about them more in a moment. Regarding protein, we don't want a super high protein intake because that will fill you up a lot and not leave enough room for a high carbohydrate intake potentially. We also don't want a super low protein intake. We want to be somewhere in the middle. You want to choose pretty lean protein sources that don't contain much fat. So things like chicken or turkey breast, lean beef, white fish, tinned tuna, whey protein, and low-fat Greek yogurt would all be great choices for protein in the period between weighing in and fighting. Now, let's talk about fats and fiber. So we want to keep these pretty low. They slow down your digestion and they can cause some stomach discomfort as well, which obviously isn't optimal leading into a fight where you want to be performing at your best. Nobody wants a dodgy stomach when they're having a fight. So this means choosing meats that are lean, that don't contain much fat, choosing white carbs, so white bread instead of brown bread, white rice instead of brown rice, for example. You can consume vegetables, but keep your portions pretty small. A lot of people will find that consuming vegetables just even psychologically helps them feel a little bit healthier, even though it probably doesn't have much of an impact. So you can consume vegetables, but keep the portions relatively small and opt for low-fat dairy and avoid, I can't stress this enough, high-fat junk food. Don't go for a Mackey's, a McDonald's after your weigh-in. It's one more day to stay relatively disciplined with your food choices. You can do it, and the reward you get for that is being able to perform at your best and not feeling awful in the ring because you've gone and had a burger post-fight. So one more day, and then you can go and enjoy those foods after the fight. And then finally, sodium. So the Rehydration Drink, the recipe with 1 liter, 50% water, 50% sports drink, and some added salt. That will take care of your sodium needs. However, you can also add salt to your meals as well, just to make it taste nicer. You can use things like soy sauce, and other salty seasonings or sauces as well, if you would like. So, in summary, I've spoken about the different weigh-in formats. I've spoken about what our bodies require after the weigh-in in order to perform our best. I've spoken about why our bodies require each of these different components. I've spoken about how much of them, carbs, water, and salt, you need to consume. And I've translated these components into specific food choices for you. So I hope you found that helpful. If you do use any of this advice, then please reach out to me on social media and let me know how you've got on. You can reach me on Instagram at James Nichol Nutrition. That's James, Nichol Nutrition on Instagram. And if you want to hire me as your nutritionist, or you can read any articles that I've written, you can do that at jamesnicholnutrition.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.